And I even talked about it a little bit yesterday in our Friday morning Torah study class about what I thought I wanted to do and how really that class was transactional, and I was using them to hopefully help me think through the sermon that I was going to give. And they did such a good job that I feel like if I give that sermon, it won't be mine, it will be theirs. But also, this was one of those mornings where, as I was sitting in my office earlier and just reading through the Parsha again, I came across something and I just had that thought, the sermon that I was going to give is not the sermon that I actually want to give this morning. The sermon that I want to give is on a different verse. So instead of talking through Jacob's life and some of his critical moments, I want to talk about where God is, based on somebody else in this Parsha, and her name is Leah. So Nathan told you that Jacob was married twice, which is true. Also, there were 2 other women in his life. There were 4 women in his life that would be the mothers of his children. But it is true that when Jacob met his second wife, Rachel, when he met his second wife, Rachel, at the well in this Parsha, that he fell in love with her and that he immediately wanted to marry her. And he asked his uncle if he could marry his cousin, first cousin, just throwing that out there. And that was the way then. And his uncle said, yes, work for me 7 years and you can marry my daughter, Rachel. And so he did that. He worked for 7 years and they got married, except when he woke up the next morning, not somehow the night before, but the next morning he saw that in fact he wasn't married to Rachel, he was married to her older sister, Leah. His uncle had pulled a switch. And he was upset and he said, why did you do this to me? And Lavan's like, well, how can I marry my younger daughter before my older daughter? And he's like, well, I would really like to marry Rachel. He said, okay, I just need some more years of work out of you. And interestingly enough, he doesn't work 7 more years before he gets to marry Rachel. He waits out the wedding week, 6 more days, and then he marries Rachel, and then works for a bunch more years. Now, if you can just put yourself in the older sister's shoes for a moment. She knows that Jacob loves her younger sister. Maybe she knows that she should have been married first in the way the system of antiquity worked. But she is entering into a relationship not out of choice, at least as far as we know, but because somebody is forcing her into it. And then immediately after, who knows what could have happened in that marriage, because they did get married. Immediately after, the next day, her husband says, not you. That's not what I wanted. Right after this, here's what happens. Right after Jacob marries his second wife in 5, 6 days or 7 days, this is what the Torah tells us. Vayar Adonai ki snua Leah, and God saw that Leah was hated. Vayiftach et rachma, and he opened her womb. Vayar Adonai, God saw her and saw what her life must have been like in that moment. That she had been pushed into a situation that she herself likely felt was degrading. And so God opened her womb, and she immediately had a child, and she named her child Reuven. And here's why. She said, Amra, ki ra'a Adonai ba'oni, because God saw my suffering. So I don't have to hypothesize whether or not Leah actually saw her situation as a bad one or a good one. She says, I was suffering, and God offered me a son because God saw my suffering. Now, when I read this morning, I was like, that feels too familiar to me. What story is this? And so I looked back at the moments in which Sarah, Abraham's wife, could not conceive a child and brought in her maidservant Hagar to do so for her. She does that. Hagar has a child. His name is Ishmael. And Sarah immediately does not like the situation that she has created because she's going to lose her position in the home. And so she tells Avraham to send her out. And Hagar gets sent out into the wilderness. And here's what happens after Te'aneha Sarai, after Sarai afflicts her. She actually afflicts Hagar. The text is clear about that. An angel of God found her out in the wilderness at a spring of water and said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, from where have you come and where do you go? And she said, I'm fleeing from Sarah, my mistress. And the angel of God said, you got to go back. V'hitani tachat yadeha. This story's got to continue with you there, and you're going to have to suffer more under her hands. But, the angel said, I'll multiply your seed, and it won't be countable because of its great number. And the angel said, here, you're pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and shall call his name Ishmael. Why? Ki shama Adonai el onyech, because God heard your suffering. She will receive a son, his name will be Ishmael, and the reason she is receiving a son is because God heard her suffering. She then calls the name of the place El Roi, God who sees me when I'm suffering. Be'er Lahai Roi. That's the famous well that Hagar went to and that Isaac went to after he was put on the altar. There is something in the Torah about suffering and God's capacity to see those who are suffering and stand in that space. Because then, in Exodus, when Moses is out shepherding the flock of his father-in-law from Midian, and he meets a bush with a fire that's burning but not being consumed. God says to Moses in that moment, I am your father's God, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God. And Moses hid his face because Moses was afraid of looking at God. Vayomer Adonai, Ra'o ra'iti et ani ami. And God said, I've seen the degradation, the suffering of my people who are in Egypt. I have seen their suffering, and I am going to intervene. You see, our story, the Israelite story, is a story that most time closest resembles Leah and Hagar in terms of what God is doing on behalf of our lives and our trajectory. The God of the Bible, of the Torah, is a God that searches out those who are pushed to the margins and inhabits that space with them and offers them a way out or a way forward. The God of Torah sees what you and I don't see most of the time. And I'm not saying like you don't see, look into the world, and it's pretty obvious that most of us don't see enough of the suffering enough of the time. But the thing is that there is an assumption, I think. My guess is it is an assumption that is now deeply ingrained inside of us, that somehow, if there is suffering, that God has left the equation, that God has abandoned that person. And in fact, the Torah comes over and over again to tell us that it is just the opposite. Where you see suffering, that is precisely in the place that you will see God looking very closely. looking very closely, waiting for a partner. You know, I've said this from the Bima before, and I'll probably say it at least twice a year. Our Torah offers the very first time in human history, at least in the human history as known through storytelling, that the power, the God of the story, comes in defense of the oppressed and not the oppressor. Very first story in human history where the all-powerful God instead of gods, but think about the stories of the gods and who they are connected to, it is not the marginalized and the oppressed. But in our story, we are the ones who suffered. Leah is the one who suffered. She had children first. Reuven, Shimon, the children that would ultimately be the ones that would save the entire story in the end. Hagar. She was with God. God was with her. I read an interview with a homeless veteran. His name was Michael Gonzalez. He was talking about what it was. He's no longer living in the streets, but he did for quite some time. He talked about not being seen, about what it was like to not feel seen by the millions of people in New York City who must have walked by over the years. He said that distinct feeling of not being seen by other humans, it has eerie effects. That's what he called it, eerie effects. It's like a wear and tear on your soul, a wear and tear on your mind and body, to not feel seen. To not feel seen is one of the most severe degradations that a human being feels in the world. And if we are paying close attention to our Torah and the God who is portrayed inside of it, then we ought find ourselves with God, next to God, seeing what God sees, not what it is we have seen up until that moment. And when we see what God sees, which is human suffering, we name it. We name it, and we notice it. We name it, we become like Hagar and Leah and the Israelites, who named their suffering and named that they felt seen. If we notice it, we become like God. That's part of what we're supposed to be doing. We become like God. And if we do something about it, if we do something about the suffering that we see when we are standing next to God in partnership, then what we become is Jewish. Then we become Yisrael, partners, strugglers with. Pope Francis, he said it best. Heschel said it best. But Pope Francis said it also, 2016. He said, in the face of suffering of so many people wounded by hunger and injustice, one cannot stand by as a spectator, because ignoring human suffering, here it is, ignoring human suffering is ignoring God. Because if I don't want to approach that woman, that man, that child, I do not approach God. If I don't want to see that woman, that man, that child, that makes me uncomfortable for whatever reason, and there are very legitimate reasons, I just have to recognize and name the fact that I am also not seeing God, because my Torah keeps telling me God is in that space, looking on very closely, offering a hand to some partner who will pull the person out of their situation. And just remember, God doesn't pull anybody out of their situation entirely. Leah went back into that weird fivesome family. Hagar had to go back. And the Israelites, they stayed in slavery for quite some time. They all needed human beings to help them out, to be partners with the master of the world, to see through God's eyes. And so when I read Parshat Va-Yeitzei right now, I don't see a story about Jacob. I see a story about a master of the world who inserts herself into the story so that we can be reminded of what it is to see the world through a divine vision and where that points us. And my guess is for most of us, it doesn't point us in the direction we are normally pointed in. My guess is. And so this is a little compass. It's a GPS. Let's get back on track. There is a lot of suffering and degradation. It's here in this city. It is in our community. And God is waiting for a partner. And I believe that we are meant to be those partners. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.